Well, there was a while when I ran a website, and I hope everybody's having a happy Monday so far, but I ran this website for about 10 years, and the website was askamechanic.info. Now, I haven't even looked up that for a while. Somebody else is probably using that handle now, but I had used that thing for, I don't know, it was a long time, and I got a lot of emails from a lot of people asking questions, and if I would had an answer for them, I'd give them an answer. And there were some people who would they weren't really looking for a serious answer. I mean, what I mean by that is these people would this one people would ask me every time they'd ask me a question, and I would give them an answer. They would say, "We've done that. What now? We've done that. What now?" They hadn't done any of it, but they were just seeing how far they could push it. And they basically were, you can pick out people like that. And then there's other people that have genuine issues. Now, I don't run that website anymore, and I don't typically do a lot of anything like that anymore because I don't have the time to do a lot of research or for anybody else and this kind of thing, But there's a ton of YouTube videos, and there's a ton of information out there on the internet anyway, more now than there was when I had my website. And like I say, I ran it for about 10 years. And finally, Joomla was what I was using to run it, and I didn't keep it updated like I should, so it kind of crashed. And so I didn't want to go to the trouble to rebuild it because I had lots and lots and lots of information on that website. But anyway, not a big deal. But I've always enjoyed kind of giving people a hand with car problem. Now, some people would call whenever I was working at the Ford dealer, and I was kind of the go-to guy over there for electronics and drivability and that kind of thing. And they would call and they would ask about a power stroke or some other issue they were having and all that. And you'd ask them straight up questions like, "Have you checked the fuel pressure?" And they hadn't. Or sometimes the biggest problem with power strokes is whenever somebody would accidentally fix a couple of them by just guessing their way through to a repair, they would begin to think they were an expert on a power stroke, and then they get one that would just beat them up something awful, and they'd spend $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 trying to fix one and still have the same problem because they didn't know, they got lucky on the first ones. And sometimes the worst thing you can do is to get lucky on one that you don't know much about, because you'll think like, well, there's not much to this, but sooner or later you find one that kicks you around. Well, this particular help desk story here, this guy had a 2000 Lincoln LS V8. He said, "In the past few months, every time I back up and start forward, and there's any slipping of the wet tires, such as the snow or on gravel, a message appears to check the traction control. Then the radio goes off, the windows won't work, and finally the car dies. I can have it jumped off, and it'll be fine until the next time this happens. Can I turn the traction control off, or will this cause any damage?" Now, some of you guys that have worked on a lot of these vehicles in this vintage are going to kind of already know what I told this guy. Because what I told him was, the traction control's not causing it, you have a bad ignition coil. Somebody's got to find out which coil or coils might be bad, let me know what happens. This is the kind of thing that would happen, and I've seen it on expeditions, and it can cause just all kinds of crazy problems that you wouldn't ever associate with one of those cop coils. And these are the coil on plug ignition coils. One of them can be bad. And anytime you have any unit, ever since I've been working on electronic engine control stuff, way back in the 80s, they were talking about how if you've got your harness laying too close to something like plug wires, so that the induced voltage around that plug wire actually creates bogus signals in the wires, it's going to cause it to do crazy things. And sometimes all you got to do is move the wires away to demonstrate, what is going on. Anyway, I told him, I said, "You probably got a bad coil," because I knew of this happening more than once. All right, so this guy came back. He had a follow-up. I love it when they send a follow-up and they tell you how you did. He said, "I've replaced 2 ignition coils, and my mechanic told me I'd sooner replace the others." Now, how he arrived at which 2 to replace, he didn't tell us this. He just said he had put 2 of them on it. I don't know if he just popped a couple of them in there and figured he was going to be, maybe getting it or not. he wasn't able to detect the problem with this. Well, the guy had never seen it before, and it seemed totally irregular that traction control would have anything to do with the radio and all this. You know, that was, you can overthink this kind of thing. Y'all might remember this story I told a while back about this Cadillac Escalade this girl brought. It was an '07 model, and she said it had an issue with a light or something. I can't remember what it was. And the traction control light was on. That's what it was. And so whenever I pulled the code, it threw us a network code. And I said, well, this may be some kind of a reflash, you know, because I didn't do the research because we weren't working on that kind of thing at the college at the time. I said, why don't you run this thing over to the Cadillac place and let them see if there's a reflash or something they need to do with the vehicle network to fix this. You know, they don't want to dig too deep into that when I was teaching stuff like transmissions and brakes, you know. And but she had brought it in for brakes because they had a traction control warning light. And then we get this network code that has, you know, nothing ostensibly to do with traction control. So she goes over there, and they told her it needed a fuel pump. It was going to cost $450. And she said, well, why in the world I need a... She said they told her the fuel pressure was too high. And I thought, well, what in the Sam Hill has that got to do with anything we're working on? So she brought it back over there, and she claimed they told her that was what was causing her traction control issue. And so I checked fuel pressure, and sure enough, it was 160 pounds. I said, good grief, that's a high fuel pressure. Wasn't supposed to be near that high, you know, like a third of that. So I said, okay, let's go ahead and pop a fuel pump in there. So we got a fuel pump from the parts store. It wasn't $450. I think it was $1,800 they wanted to put a fuel pump in it. It was $450 is what we paid for the fuel pump, which came with a regulator on the pump. We put that thing on there, and when that fuel pressure got back down where it was supposed to, the network code went away, and so did the traction control light. And you might say, well, the only way somebody could know this is if they had happened to notice there was high fuel pressure and decided to fix that first, and then found out by accident it fixed a network code and a traction control light. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we are dealing with nowadays on these new vehicles with their electronics. All right, this is another one. I have a 98 Dodge Grand Caravan. Just bought it about a month ago, and it has over 100,000 miles on it. Running fine for about 2 weeks. Transmission leaked through oil. They got, well, it was transmission oil leak, okay? So the garage where I brought the car repaired, in other words, he bought a car from a garage, and they repaired the transmission. 2 weeks down the road, he found that sometimes his gears would slip. If he put the gear in reverse, it would not catch, and the engine would just rev, right? What's this sound like to you? All right, so he says, when I'm driving, sometimes the gear would go to neutral and the car doesn't go forward. I had to stop and put the gear in place, but sometimes it takes a while before it catches. On reverse, I had to put the car on drive and then back to reverse before it would work. And he said, your help's greatly appreciated. Okay, this is a transmission problem. What does that sound like to you? You know, go ahead and, you know, drop me a note if help desk story number 2 sounds to you like the transmission is low on fluid. I said, sounds like the transmission is low on fluid, especially if it drops into neutral when you're going around a curve and it doesn't want to engage first thing in the morning. Check the transmission fluid with the engine warm and running it in neutral. Let me know what happens. All right, so this guy right here needed to check transmission fluid. Now, when it's cold, the transmission fluid, you know, you might notice it'll be lower on the dipstick when it's cold than when the transmission is at operating temperature. And so that's something that's really important, and you need to check it running in neutral if it's a Dodge too, you know. Obviously you got to check it running on any vehicle, but in neutral if it's a Dodge. So I took the car back to the garage. This is the guy's follow-up. They kept it for half a day and told me it would cost over $500 to fix it. I told them I'll think about it, so I took it to another place, asked them to check the transmission fluid. They said it's low, they filled it up, and I don't have that problem anymore. Now, it's fairly easy, if you're not really careful, to underfill a transmission. I mean, and the dipstick will lie to you and everything else. I've seen this happen before. Whenever somebody would put a transmission back in that they had, you know, drained the fluid and all that kind of stuff. And whenever they put the fluid in it, they're pulling the dipstick out. Maybe they're holding it wrong, or maybe it's splattered on the, you know, when you pour it in the dipstick tube down there, sometimes it'll smear fluid on the dipstick whenever you're sticking the dipstick in there, and you'll think you got more fluid than you got, and then after a while it turns out you wind up with issues because you're a couple of quarts low or something like that. And it's obviously what happened here. So that all we basically did was, it's a whole lot smarter to go ahead and make sure it's full of fluid than it is to try to sell them a $500 transmission overall, right? This guy says he got a 94 Ford Ranger 3 liter running rough, took it to a shop, they replaced number 2 injector, It fixed the problem of running rough, but since then it's had a problem. If I let it sit for about an hour to 5 hours, I have to crank it a couple of times to get it to start. When it starts, it runs rough for a couple of seconds, and sometimes you can smell gas like it's flooded. So I took it back to the same mechanic, replaced fuel pressure regulator, fuel pump relay, EEC relay, checked and reset timing to no avail. He says he has no idea. Please help, thanks. Now that, you know, for a shop to tell you that I don't know what's wrong with it, you need to take it somewhere else. I don't get that either. That's kind of like when I used to call the local parts guy that had he had a parts house over there close to the college, and I liked doing business with the guy because he was a local dude, and he had a parts house. It was a franchise parts house, but I don't remember what it was. I mean, at the time, Parts Master or Parts Plus or something. Anyway, he said I would be asking a particular part, and he said, "Well, I can't find that. I guess you'll just have to get it from somewhere else." You know, what parts guy is going to tell you that? You'll have to get it from somewhere else. A really good parts man is going to find the part you want, and he's going to take pride in the fact that he can find the part you want and put it on the counter and sell it to you and all that. But I had seen, and I was thinking about this guy's vehicle before, I had seen a Jeep Cherokee several years ago, and I've seen other vehicles that follow this same rule. And this guy said he would crank it up and it would skip a little bit and then it would clear up and all that. So what I did, and on that Jeep, you know, the injector is real easy to get to. What I did was I let it sit out there and I fired it up, and it was skipping when I fired it up. I shut it off while it was still skipping. And immediately as soon as I shut it off, I pulled all of the plugs out. And plug number 3 or 4, or whichever one it was soaking wet with fuel and had soot all over it. But all the rest of the plugs were clean. I says, okay, so pull the injectors out, which was easy to do on that one because you pull a couple of bolts out and then you know, make sure that the injectors, you know, stay with the fuel rail when you're pulling them out so you're not gas doesn't run everywhere. And so you got them injectors out of there, and the tip on the injector that corresponded with that spark plug was squeaky clean, but all the other injectors were kind of grungy and dirty. That means that injector's dripping fuel. And so I told this guy that he needed an injector. He thought I was guessing at it or something, and he wanted to, you know, try to question my diagnosis. I said, look, I did this scientifically. I don't know what you're complaining about. We need to go ahead and replace the injector because I can tell you it's leaking right now. And so he said, okay, we'll go ahead and do that. Well, that fixes the truck, you know. But one of the first times I had seen that, on some platforms, one dripping injector can flood the whole engine so that it takes a long time to start. I first saw that on a Thunderbird that had a V6 in it. And the guy had been used to it, just as soon as you breathed on the key, it'd fire up. But he got to where he would have to spin it for 45 seconds, you know, like almost a minute. He'd be spinning it, and then it'd finally fire up and it'd run a little rough and it'd go on. And it turned out that that particular Thunderbird, I discovered, had 3 leaking fuel injectors on it. But I've seen one leaking fuel injector do the same thing. It also depends on how the manifold is configured, how many cylinders it has, all that kind of stuff. But in this particular case, I figured, well, I'm going to give this guy the best advice that I can. And so this guy, and I said, what you do, get it to the point where it'll exhibit a symptom, shut it off while it's running badly. You can also find a leaking cylinder head gasket this way if you've got one that skips when you first start it and then it clears up. If you pull it out and there's steam and stuff coming off one of the spark plugs, that's going to be a head gasket issue. But in this one, pull out all the plugs. A sooty or wet plug indicates a dripping injector. If you remove, see, I was thinking he's smelling gas, so it must have been one of these. So indicates a dripping injector. If you remove the injectors, that same injector will have a very clean tip. The non-leaking injectors will have dirty tips. Okay, this was the best piece of information I could give him. And this was his follow-up. Thanks, works great now, Tom. I don't think he did a dadgum thing. He was just trying to give me some kind of follow-up. If he did that and figured out what it was wrong, I would rather have him tell me, well, I did this, I found that, and I replaced this and that. He didn't say that. He just gave me, thanks, now works great. Whoopee. All right. Now, in this consumer-driven world, folks tend to take their business elsewhere if they don't like the merchandise or the service. I don't know at the time. I've seen people bounce around from shop to shop. They go to shop 1, they pay $500, it's still not fixed. They go to shop 2, pay $400 more, it's still not fixed. They go to the third shop begging for a free fix because they're out of money. Anybody that runs a shop has seen people who will show up at their door that said, I spent $500 at shop A, I spent $400 at shop B or whatever. Now I'm out of money and I need you to fix this thing as cheap as you can. when what they should have done was gone back to shop A as soon as they weren't satisfied and say, hey, look at here, you know, we need to fix this. Now, that's what I asked them. Why didn't you take it back to the first shop and have them make good on the repair instead of bouncing around? Because once it's been to shop 1 and then you take it to shop 2, if you go back to shop 1 will say, no, shop 2 did this, we didn't do this, and it's a he said, she said, throwing the ball back and forth, hot potato, everybody's passing it around. And they want somebody to, you know, tighten one bolt or fix one wire or, you know, do some kind of miracle and, you know, take care of all that stuff. You know, I've told similar stories to that before, but you get the point. Now, some of them tell me they've gone back to the first shop only to be told more money needs to be spent to fix the same problem, and that kind of thing frustrates. Who wouldn't lose confidence in a shop that pulls that kind of stunt? There was this lady I knew, and I had known her for a very, very long time. She was an elderly lady. And there was this guy that was kind of helping look after her, you know, that was related to her. And he called me and he says, can you look at such and such a lady's car? He called her by name, and I knew who she was. And her husband had been a good mechanic, and he had died and left her widowed and all. And so she drove this car, and it was this, actually, if I'm not mistaken, her car was a 4-door, but it was a Cutlass Calais of this vintage. And it was a fairly decent old mid-80s car, you know, had a V6 in it. And so I says, okay, bring it over here, we'll have a look at it. Wasn't idling good, it rode real rough and all that. And so whenever he brought it over there, it had, I found out when I drove it that one of the tires had a huge bubble on it, was about to come apart, and it would just bounce you all over the road. It was awful. And so I said, the first thing we need to do is replace a couple of these tires. So we put a couple of new tires on the back and put the ones that weren't quite so good on the front, which is what you're supposed to do. And it drove smoother then than it did before. And then we actually found out that the ignition module, we put a timing light on one of the plug wires and dragged it around in there where we could see it in the floorboard of the car and the shaded part under the dash while we were driving the car down the road. And whenever the car would cut up, the timing light would flash irregularly. And I said, that's going to be a problem with the ignition module because the spark is what's doing this. And so we actually replaced the ignition module, got that straightened out. But it still had a little bit of a rough idle to it, even though it ran better, ran smoother, ran better going down the road. It had a rough idle to it. And we found out that the cam sensor was not putting out any signal at all. And what was interesting to me was the intake was kind of warm like it would be if the EGR was flowing all the time. That will also make a rough idle, but it also makes low vacuum. As I remember, she had a warm intake, but she didn't have low vacuum, and that sent me to looking at that cam sensor. So we replaced her cam sensor, got her a cam signal, smoothed it out. It ran really great, and she was really happy. But now by the time she paid for the tire and all the other stuff we did, she had to pay us like $550. But the problem was, before the car ever came to us, she took it to a shop over here in town. Of course, you know, the school where I taught was 60 miles up to the west. But she came over here to this little town, the shop in town, you know, I guess it was a random shop. I don't know if she knew somebody that worked there or whatever. And she went in there, a little blue-haired, little white-haired little old lady. And she went in there and she asked them if they look at her car. And so they said, yeah, sure, we'll have a look at it. And they put a fuel filter on it. That's all they did. They put a fuel filter on it, and they charged her some amount of money. I don't remember. I never did know what they charged her the first time she worked on it, but that's all they did. And see, if they'd have driven the car, they'd have felt that tire and at least tried to sell her a tire, it seems to me like. You know, sometimes when you're working behind somebody, you can tell they didn't drive the car. Anyway, I said, so she drove from that shop to the other side of town with the car running just as bad or worse. And then whenever she got out at the grocery store, she noticed there was a huge puddle of gas growing under the car back in the fuel tank area. And so she didn't want to drive it with that big gas leak. So she calls the shop and she says, hey, I've got a huge gas leak here. And so they sent a wrecker to get the car to bring it back to their shop. And I guess they hired one of the local wrecker companies. And they hauled it back to the shop. They charged her $85 for the wrecker bill, plus they charged her a bunch more money to fix the fuel leak they created when they replaced the fuel filter. And it's no wonder she was frustrated with them and wanted somebody else to look at it, you know. And so anyway, I kind of put the cart before the horse, but all the stuff we found when they got it over there was what got the car to running like it was supposed to, and she was really happy with it and all that. Old cars need a lot of work. Now, from the shop owner's technician's perspective, it just seems like the deck is stacked against us. There are some vehicles you don't need to take in because once you get the vehicle fixed, there's more invested in the car than it's worth. And in those cases, it's wise to go ahead and get the money up front before you do the work, or they may stick you with a vehicle you can't sell for the money that you've got invested in it. Everybody's got their own policy on that kind of thing, but at the place where I used to work, if the vehicle was really old and wasn't worth much of anything, and they were okay in this huge repair, the dealership got burned a time or two on that kind of thing, because they have a tendency to just want to, they'll say go ahead and fix it, and $1,200-$1,500 later they don't have the money to pay the bill, and you're stuck with the vehicle. And even if you take it down here for a mechanics lien auction, you're not going to get the money back that you spent on it, and they may be there trying to buy the darn thing back for a couple of $100 so that they can get the repair cheaper. People are doing that kind of thing. But anyway, I drew a ticket on an old Ford pickup one time. Looked a lot like this one, almost the same car. This is not a picture of the actual truck, but it looked a lot like it. And it was a rough idle stalling problem. It had clogged idle air control passages, a nasty throttle body, gasoline contaminated engine oil, original misfiring spark plugs, a plugged fuel filter, late ignition timing, a throttle position sensor with a ragged signal, and lots of vacuum leaks. I mean, this was a disaster. This truck hadn't hardly had the hood opened on it in for the last 50 or 100,000 miles, and it was in terrible shape. Hadn't been maintained. PCV system had to be redone too. That's something I didn't yet include on this list. Well, we made an estimate, received the go-ahead, made the repairs. I test drove a truck. It ran really good. It idled good. It started good. Everything was right. The bill wasn't cheap. It was pretty expensive. But then he comes back about 3 or 4 days later, and he goes, my truck still ain't fixed. And I says, well, I found out when I rechecked it that the lift pump, those older vehicles before 1990 on a Ford had a lift pump in the tank and a high pressure fuel pump on the frame. If the lift pump in the tank stopped delivering fuel to the high pressure pump on the frame, then the high pressure pump on the frame would get really noisy, it'd get cavitated, you'd lose pressure, and you'd wind up with a truck that didn't run right. That's what his problem was. But that lift pump worked most of the time. You could slap the tank and it would start running, and you might drive it 2 or 3 times, and then the third or fourth time you drove it, that lift pump wouldn't work. So in addition to all the other work, it was because of maintenance neglect. He needed a lift pump, but he was trying to act like we had, stuck it to him. Charged him a bunch of money, and we still didn't fix his truck. So I hadn't sold the guy nothing he didn't need to start with. That's what I'm always evaluating these circumstances right here to see if I'm, in the wrong. I gave him the estimate for replacing the dead end tank pump. It was about $250 for the pump and the labor to put it in there. He wanted me to guarantee this fuel pump was going to fix his ragged, rusty, ball-tired, ill-maintained pickup. If this was your customer, what would you tell him? This is one of those things where it's like you can't win. I'm going to tell you, I had another customer one time that had he had one of these trucks, for years he had a truck with 2 tanks on them. Okay, so the 2 tank truck, this guy would come in here and the truck's running bad and all that kind of stuff. And so I worked on it and, cleaned the injectors and did some other stuff, and made some adjustments and all that kind of thing. And, or did I clean the injectors? I don't think I did clean the injectors, because that was something that came up later. But I did some work. I checked everything out, and I did a tune-up and set a timing and all that kind of stuff. And I drove it, and it ran really good. And then he comes back, and he's shaking his head, no, it's still not right and all that. So I said, well, I need to check the fuel pressure, I guess. So I go out there and I checked it, and I'm smelling gas that's rotten, like it came out of a lawnmower that's been sitting up for 3 years, and it didn't have any fuel stabilizer in it. And I said, this is bad gas. Where did this rotten gas come from? Because the gas didn't smell like this the other day. He said, well, I don't hardly ever use the rear tank, and so when I switched it onto the rear tank, that's when it started running bad. But I did put a bunch of good gas in there with the rotten gas. And I said, okay, let me ask you this. If you've got a half a quart of sour milk, how much good milk are you going to have to put with that sour milk to make all the milk good? I mean, you're actually adding good gasoline to bad gasoline, trying to make the bad gasoline good gasoline. That's not the way that works. So I told him that's, and at the time, you ain't gonna believe this, but it was only $36 to clean the injector. And the original bill that we had charged him wasn't all that much. I think it might have been $75 for the other work that I had done. But it was an older truck, kind of similar to this F-150 I'm looking at here. And it was him playing musical gas tank, switching it back and forth. He knew it ran bad on the rear gas tank. But rather than just coming clean and saying it runs lousy on the rear tank but good on the front one, he basically tried to, flip it around and make it look like we were doing something wrong. And he didn't want to pay to have his injector cleaned, because we're going to need to clean the injectors. You've been running this rotten gas through them. I guarantee you they got varnish and flakes of crud in them, that need to be melted away by this injector cleaning stuff. He didn't want to pay for that. So he went to the service manager complaining about it. And to his credit, the service manager saw this guy as the kind of problem he was, and he gave the guy his money back for the previous repair and says, take your truck somewhere else and get it worked on, because we're not going to work on it here anymore, Because this guy was he was constantly trying to play tricks, and jerk you around and all that kind of stuff. Some customers will do that because they think they're smarter than you are, and they feel, and you can see what they're doing, and all that. But anyway, this heater on this Expedition had a leaking heater core, but it had been replaced only 2 years ago, but it was leaking again. Been replaced by another shop for leaking. And so I said, well, we're going to have to put a heater core in it, and I knew the person that owned this vehicle pretty well. We'd worked on it quite a bit, but she was the one that told me they'll another shop and put a heater core in it. So what we did was we went ahead and pulled the dash, got in there to the heater core, and it's right here, but you can see where it's leaking there, and there's also rust down there in the bottom. And the first thing my guy noticed when he removed the panel and accessed the blend door that was right there by the heater core was that the blend door was in there upside down. And he was sharp enough to catch that. This is from the leak right here. And so anyway, he was going to put the heater core in it. Well, what we figured out was, what we thought we might have figured out, you're going to have a heater core that's going to leak. You see this restrictor that's in here? Like, rather than having two different size heater core inlets, this, a big one and a small one, you're always supposed to hook the hose coming from, it's supposed to flowing in is supposed to go into the smaller or the restricted hole, and flowing out is supposed to come out the unrestricted hole or the larger pipe. If it doesn't, you're going to have it. Imagine when you put your thumb over a water hose, and the water hose swells and gets tight, right? That's going to be happening to the heater core too. And if you put the inflow here so that it's restricted over here, it's basically going to put enough pressure on that heater core that it's going to pop the heater core. And that happens sometimes. There was back in the, sometime in the 90s, I can't remember, late 80s, early 90s, there was Ford came out with this fix on these Tauruses that had noisy heater cores, and they wanted a restrictor like that one mounted in the hose going into the heater core, and it was supposed to slow the coolant down going through there, and it would make the heater work better, and it also would cause it not to be so noisy. But this guy come in, and they did that recall, come back, heater core's leaking. Well, they put a heater core in there, come back, heater core's leaking again. So they put another heater core in there, come back, heater core's leaking again. And the service writer was a really good friend of mine, and he said that guy came back with veins bulging out of his neck, saying my heater core's leaking again, and I want to talk to the service manager now, It was just a funny conversation, but it turned out that what happened was whoever put that restrictor in that heater core inlet actually put it in the outlet or hooked the hoses up backward one. I don't remember what happened. But that was what was going on with that. They kept busting new heater cores because they had the restrictor in the outlet going back to the engine, and it swole the heater core up and it popped it, which is, But you got to pay attention to the size, and you got to make sure you know which way the coolant's flowing too, and there's a way to do that. I'll cover that in a minute. But anyway, but a cooling system with an off-balance pH, acid or alkaline, lower than 7, will create electrolysis that will not only attack the engine block, but the aluminum heater core, and we needed to go the extra mile on this one. Put it back together right, make sure we flush the coolant. There are these radiator caps you can buy, and you can look these up online. I should have had that on my slide presentation, that have an anode made onto it. Like aluminum boats that operate in salt water have got these anodes on the back of the boat. I think that's what they call them. And what they're supposed to do is the electrolysis from the seawater attacks the anodes rather than the aluminum boat. And that keeps the aluminum boat from melting away and starting to leak. And so as those anodes melt away, they have to replace them. Well, they make these radiator caps that's got a little anode on those. If you got a lot of electrolysis and pH out of balance in your engine block, for whatever reason, it'll eat that anode away instead of dissolving your engine block. A pretty cool idea somebody came up with. You can look that up though. I think you'd call it a radiator cap with an anode for electrolysis or something like that. You can find them online. But what we did was, you remember I told you about the clear hose? This is the clear hose right here. And what we did with that was we took that clear hose and hooked it up. You just stick it in. If you get it in the right size, you can just stick it in the heater hose, because this is only going to be a temporary thing anyway. Have it outside where it's not going to make a mess on your service bay. And we had this one out there on the steam cleaner slab. And you could fire it up, and you could see that crud going through there. I said, okay, so what we did on this one here, because there was nothing in there but clear water and rust anyway, it didn't have antifreeze in it. And of course that's a problem too. If you ain't got antifreeze in it, it's going to get rusty and sludgy really bad. We actually found out which way the coolant was going, right out of here. And I don't remember which way it was going, but we found out by that, putting this clear hose in there. That's also a good way you can check and see if you've got good flow through your heater core coming from your water pump. We've troubleshot bad water pumps like this where the impeller was melted away, or it was spinning on the shaft or something like that. So I pulled the one out, and when I found out, let's say I found out it was coming this way, pull this hose out, and I put it out there in a where it was basically just running down across the parking lot, because it was just kind of a downhill thing toward the diesel department. And so we made sure that we had a water hose going into the inlet for the where you fill up the cooling system, and we cranked the truck and we let it pump this crap out into that parking lot for quite some time while we were keeping water in there, just flowing steady in there with a water hose. So we were slowly replacing all of this rusty crud with the clean water that we were putting in, and what that was doing was washing all of this stuff away. And we eventually cleared all of that rust and sludge out of her system, got it all put back together. And we put the heater hoses on there the right way, because now we knew which way it was flowing and which one needed to be hooked to where, and that took care of that. So this local shop guy called me, see if I had anybody he could use. He grumbled that every technician he hired for the past 2 years had disappointed him. He was paying these guys a generous straight time salary. That's what he was doing. He didn't want to dibble dabble with commission. He wanted to do that. Of course, a commission mechanic by and large will work harder than somebody that's on salary, because they're basically chasing that carrot. And so he said, I hire these people, they'll work really good for 2 or 3 months, and they get tired, can't get no work out of them, and and the customer get disappointed. So they start out strong, but they go bad. So I sent this guy, the guy that did this job on this expedition, and he broke that pattern. He was solid, he was productive, and he was dependable. And he worked there for a pretty good while until a job opened up at the GM dealer, which is where he wanted to work his whole life anyway. And he's at a GM dealer now, and he's making really, really good money over there. I got 2 guys at that GM dealer that I trained and put over there, and they're making a massive, really good paycheck over there at that place, turning lots of hours and all that. This one guy's job is to do all of their modifications, putting the brush guards and the step sides and all that kind of stuff on there, and toolboxes and whatever else they want to put on there, bed liners, tonneau covers, and all that kind of stuff. That's a lot of what he does over there, and he's really good at that and doing a really good job of it. But anyway, he's right where he needs to be, that guy is. But it's really hard to find anybody nowadays that has any kind of work ethic. And if you find somebody like that, people want to, I mean, sometimes they leave and go to a place that's going to pay them more, you know, and if the person that was paying them, you know, X number of dollars an hour or whatever doesn't want to match what the other company, it depends on how valuable the employee is. I used to tell my people when I was training them, you know, if the place you're working is having to get rid of people for whatever reason or lay them off, you want to be the one that they don't lay off. You want to be the one that's so reliable and knows how to do so much stuff, and your work is so good that they're going to keep you even if they leave everybody else. And I put this one guy through my program, young guy, but he's kind of a big fella, and he went to work. He went to work at a dealer for a while, but he was too far from home, and he kind of needed to look after his mother because she was getting older. And he found a job at a tire store about a mile from where he lived in a town down there close to the Florida line. And he went to work at that place, and he stayed there for about 3 months. And after he had worked there for 3 months, and that guy that owned that tire store saw what a good dynamo of a worker he was, that guy, and this is crazy, but the guy at that tire store fired everybody else that worked there, even his own daughter. I think she worked in the office, I don't know. And he told this guy that I put to work down there that I had trained, he said, you and I can run this tire store right by ourselves. We don't need all these other people. And about a month later, it was Christmas time, and this guy took the guy that I trained to Lowe's, and he says, you pick out any Cobalt toolbox you want and I'll buy it for you. And he picked out a big old fine Cobalt toolbox, and he was up there talking to me later on about that. He was basically, you know, had some time off for whatever reason. He come up there and sat in my office and told me all that story about that. But I thought that was really really spectacular. But I did know he was a hard worker whenever he was under me, and he was mature for a guy his age, and he was also a big, strong boy. And so he has done a tremendous amount of good work down there. As far as I know, he's still working in that same place. Anyway, I will have more to say next time. And I have discovered too that if I don't name these videos right, there won't be as many people watching them. You got to name it something so that the people who are thinking about watching a video or doing a search will discover the video that I made. So anyway, I got to come up with a creative name for this one. But I'll see you guys next time, and I appreciate you watching.